The air smelled like autumn. It was that familiar scent of dry leaves and distant wood smoke, the kind of smell that carries memories whether you want it to or not. Henry sat quietly on the creaky old rocking chair out on the front porch, the same spot where he'd spent countless afternoons over the years. The chair swayed back and forth with a soft rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, steady and unhurried. 82 years old, alone. The small white house on the edge of the sleepy town had once been filled with voices, laughter, footsteps running down the hall. Now the silence pressed gently against the walls, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets or the rustling of leaves blown across the yard. Henry folded his hands on his lap, the skin thin and marked with time, veins like rivers beneath the surface. His eyes, though tired, still held the soft blue of the sky after rain. He gazed out toward the street, where golden leaves swirled along the sidewalk, carried by the soft breeze. The trees were half naked already, their branches reaching out like fingers, trying to hold on to what little remained. Somewhere, a child's laughter echoed faintly, a sound carried from a few houses down. It reminded him of his own children, long grown, now scattered across the country like the leaves outside. Busy lives, busy schedules, calls on birthdays, maybe Christmas. And he understood, he really did. Life moves fast when you're young, but out here, life had slowed to the pace of falling leaves. Henry rocked a little slower, his hands tightening briefly around the arms of the chair. The quiet was both a comfort and a curse. It gave him space to think, but thoughts could be dangerous companions when the house was this still. On the small wooden table beside him sat a single-framed photograph. A woman smiling, eyes bright, hair pinned up just so. Sarah. His Sarah. The girl with the soft voice and the laugh that could warm an entire room. She'd been gone for 6 years now, though sometimes Henry still caught himself turning to say something to her, forgetting for a moment that the chair beside him stayed empty. The ache of missing her hadn't dulled, it had only settled deeper, like roots in the earth. He reached over, brushing a finger gently against the frame. "Still miss you, love," he whispered. The wind picked up just then, rustling the tall grass at the edge of the yard. A single leaf floated down and landed at his feet, its edges curled and brown, the last breath of summer's green. Henry leaned back, let his eyes close for a moment. Autumn had always been her favorite. The colors, she used to say, looked like the world was giving one last grand performance before winter's hush. And now, here he was, watching the show alone. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. The air held that gentle bite of the season turning, a whisper that change was near. Henry felt it in his bones, in the slow rhythm of his heart. There are some stories we tell ourselves to keep going, and there are some we tuck away, too painful to speak aloud. But on that quiet autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows stretched long across the porch, Henry felt the memories beginning to stir. Soft at first, like the first notes of a familiar song, he let the chair rock gently beneath him, and he began to remember. The past, when it comes back, doesn't always knock. Sometimes it simply walks in, unannounced, familiar, and full of color. Henry was 18 the first time he saw Sarah. It was the summer of 1959, and the world felt wide open. The days were long, the nights were soft with the hum of cicadas, and the small town where Henry had grown up seemed like the entire universe. Back then, everything smelled of fresh-cut grass and gasoline, the buzz of old radios playing Elvis and Patsy Cline drifting through open windows. Sarah had just moved into the house 2 doors down. Her family had come from the next county over, chasing work like so many others did after the war. She was 17, with a smile that arrived before she did and lingered long after she'd gone. There was something about her, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the way she hummed under her breath as she walked, that caught Henry's attention from the first moment. He had been helping his father paint the fence when he saw her. She was standing beneath the big oak tree at the edge of their yard, hands behind her back, watching the world as if it had promised her something beautiful. "Hi," she said when their eyes met. Henry, caught off guard, managed only a clumsy wave. It was nothing like the grand beginnings he'd read about in books. No dramatic gestures, no sweeping music. Just a boy with paint on his hands and a girl with a smile that made him forget his own name. But sometimes that's all it takes. Over the weeks that followed, they crossed paths again and again. At the corner store near the town library, at the little diner where Sarah worked part-time, pouring coffee with the grace of someone twice her age. And each time, Henry found himself standing a little taller, speaking a little clearer. Their first real conversation happened by accident. A sudden summer storm had caught them both at the park, seeking shelter beneath the same awning. They sat there, side by side, listening to the rain drum against the metal roof. "You like the rain?" she asked. Henry shrugged. "I don't mind it." "Me neither," she said, smiling softly. "Feels honest somehow." That was the start of it. They began walking home together after church on Sundays. They shared milkshakes at the diner on Saturday nights when Henry could spare the change. They talked about small things at first: school, movies, music. But soon the conversation stretched longer, deeper, like roots growing quietly beneath the surface. Sarah told him about her dreams of seeing the ocean, how she wanted to stand at the edge of the water and feel small in the best possible way. Henry told her about his hope to build something with his hands, maybe work as a carpenter like his uncle. Simple dreams, honest ones. One evening, as the last light of the day faded into twilight, they sat beneath that same oak tree where they'd first met. Fireflies blinked lazily around them, and the air smelled faintly of wild flowers. "Do you ever think about the future?" Sarah asked. "All the time," Henry replied. "And what do you see?" He looked at her then, really looked. The curve of her cheek, the way her eyes caught the last bit of light. "I see you," he said softly. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was true. Sarah reached over, took his hand in hers, and for a moment the whole world held its breath. They were young, they were foolish, and they were entirely sure that love, their kind of love, could weather anything. The seasons turned, as they always do. Summer slipped into autumn, and with the change came the quiet certainty of what they wanted. One crisp October morning, standing on the porch of her family's house, Henry asked Sarah if she'd marry him someday. She didn't answer right away. She just smiled that soft, knowing smile of hers, leaned in and kissed him gently on the cheek. "I thought you'd never ask," she whispered. And just like that, the story of Henry and Sarah began. Not with fireworks, not with grand speeches, but with the simple, steady promise of two hearts choosing each other. Love, no matter how strong, is always tested by time and by distance. The year was 1962. The world felt uneasy. Talk of war echoed from the radios, printed in bold letters across the front pages of the daily papers. Young men across the country were being called to serve, and Henry was no exception. He had just turned 21 when the draft letter arrived, a single piece of paper that would change the course of everything. The words were formal, cold, typed in black ink, but their meaning cut deep. He was to report for basic training within the month. Henry remembered the way Sarah held that letter in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly at the edges. She didn't cry, not at first. She simply looked at him, eyes steady, searching his face for something solid to hold on to. "So, this is real," she said softly. Henry reached for her hands, pressing them between his own. "I'll come back to you," he promised. "I swear it." The weeks before his departure passed too quickly. Like sand slipping through open fingers, they spent every moment they could together, walking the familiar streets of their hometown, sitting beneath their oak tree, holding each other close as if they could store enough warmth to last through the cold months ahead. One night, just before he was set to leave, they danced slowly in the living room of Sarah's house. The radio played an old love song, the kind their parents used to hum. Henry wasn't much of a dancer, but it didn't matter. Sarah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Don't you dare forget this," she whispered. "Not for a second," he replied. And then he was gone. The training camp was a world away from the quiet comfort of home. Long days, hard drills, the constant hum of discipline and duty. But in the lonely hours of night, when the barracks grew quiet and the lights dimmed, Henry would take out the small photo of Sarah he kept tucked inside his jacket. Her smile, even in black and white, had the power to soften the edges of those harsh days. They wrote letters, dozens of them, folded carefully, sealed with hope. Sarah's handwriting brought pieces of home into his hands. She wrote about the weather, the neighbors, small bits of town gossip. But beneath every word, Henry could feel the ache of missing him, the longing stitched between the lines. And he wrote back, telling her of the places he'd seen, the friends he'd made, the nights when sleep wouldn't come, because thoughts of her filled every quiet space. War, as it often does, showed Henry things he'd never wanted to see. Friends who didn't make it home. The weight of decisions too heavy for someone so young. There were days when the fear crept in, whispering doubts, asking whether he'd truly be able to keep his promise. But Sarah's letters were like lifelines, pulling him back to the promise of something better waiting on the other side. 2 years passed before he saw her again. When he stepped off the train that brought him back, he searched the crowd, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. And there she was, standing at the edge of the platform, a bouquet of wildflowers in her hands, eyes wide and shining. For a moment, neither of them moved. The noise of the station, the people rushing by, all of it faded into nothing. Then Henry dropped his bag, ran to her, diplomats, and pulled her into his arms. "I told you I'd come back," he breathed. Sarah smiled through her tears, holding him as tightly as she could. "And I told you I'd be right here," she whispered back. They had made it through the storm, but life, they would learn, had more trials waiting just beyond the horizon. Peace, when it finally comes, does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, it slips in quietly, like sunlight through a half-open window. Henry and Sarah settled into the gentle rhythm of life after his return. There was no need for grand declarations. The fact that they were together again, standing side by side beneath the same sky, was enough. They married that spring in a small ceremony beneath the oak tree where they had first met. It wasn't fancy. There were no gilded invitations or towering cakes, just family, close friends, and the soft sway of wind through the branches above. Sarah wore a simple dress, her hair pinned loosely, a crown of wildflowers resting gently on her head. Henry, in his best suit, couldn't stop smiling. "I've never been good with words," he said as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "But I'll spend the rest of my life showing you what you mean to me." Their first home was modest. A little white cottage on the edge of town, the paint chipped in places, the roof needing more work than Henry cared to admit. But to them, it was perfect. They filled it with second-hand furniture, patchwork quilts, and laughter that echoed from room to room. On the porch, Sarah planted a small garden of roses and daisies, her hands deep in the soil, her face glowing with the joy of simple things. Life in those early years was made of small rituals. Every morning they shared coffee at the kitchen table, the steam curling into the air between them as sunlight spilled through the window. Henry would read the paper aloud, adding his own commentary, while Sarah shook her head and smiled at his stubborn opinions. In the evenings, after dinner was done and the dishes were put away, they would put on records and dance slowly in the living room. Henry, still awkward on his feet, let Sarah lead more often than not. She'd hum along to the music, her voice soft and sweet, especially when their favorite song, Autumn Leaves, played on the turntable. Those were the days they would both remember as the happiest. They worked hard. Henry found a job as a carpenter, steady hands building shelves, fixing fences, mending what was broken. Sarah taught piano lessons to the neighborhood children, her soft patience guiding little fingers across ivory keys. Money was never abundant, but neither of them cared much for riches. What they had was enough. On Sundays, they walked to the small church at the center of town, hand in hand. They always sat in the second row from the back, close enough to hear, far enough to feel like their own little island. Afterward, they'd stop by the diner, share a slice of pie, and talk about everything or nothing at all. They dreamed together, quietly, of what might come next. Maybe children, maybe more travels. Sarah still spoke of seeing the ocean one day, standing at its edge, letting the waves lap at her feet. Someday, she would say, eyes full of hope. Henry always nodded. We'll get there. The years, like the seasons, turned softly. Spring gave way to summer, summer to autumn. The trees outside their window grew taller, stronger, their roots deepening beneath the earth. And through it all, Henry and Sarah held fast to each other. It wasn't a life without hardship. There were lean times, long days, unexpected bills that arrived like uninvited guests. But they faced those troubles together, shoulder to shoulder, hearts tied to the same hope. At night, when the world outside grew quiet and the stars blinked overhead, Henry would sometimes wake to find Sarah watching him, her hand gently resting on his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "What are you thinking about?" he'd ask. She'd smile, lean closer, and whisper, "How lucky I am." Henry never found the words to tell her just how much she meant to him. Not fully, not completely, but he hoped she knew. He hoped that in the soft touches, the shared laughter, the long silences filled with understanding, his love spoke clearly enough. They were not rich. They were not famous. But in that little white house, tucked away at the edge of a quiet town, they were happy. And sometimes that's all the story a heart needs. Some endings don't come with warning. It started with a knock on the door, slowly, quietly, like a fading melody you aren't ready to stop hearing. Henry opened it to find a young girl standing on the porch, no more than 10 years old, just a small her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Serious, she assured, a shy look in her eyes. She brushed it off. "Hi," with the same gentle smile. "My name's Emma. I live next door." The one that could convince the sun to shine on a cloudy day. He had seen her before, running across the lawn, drawing visits followed on the driveway, then tests, but they'd never spoken. Each my mum said you might need help with the well of worry, Emma added, pointing at the yard where golden piles had begun to gather beneath his thumb tracing small circles. Henry looked past her skin, then back as if he could will the fear away. "You want to help break?" The diagnosis Emma came on a Tuesday afternoon. "I like being outside. Cancer. And Mum says it's good to help neighbors." Inoperable. Something about her words felt heavy in the room. Too big for the space they occupied. "Let's get you a rake." Sarah sat quietly. That afternoon, listening, they worked side by side, slowly. Henry talked more as the leaves piled willing up, himself to stay school, upright, her little brother who ate everything, when how she wanted to be a writer when she grew up, to find the right thing to say. But the words Henry mostly listened, in his throat, chiming in now between and then, grief letting her words fill the quiet that had become Sarah too familiar, resting her when palm they finished, against his cheek. She followed him up to the porch. "It's okay, love," she whispered. "Do you live here all by yourself? We'll face this like we've faced everything Henry else. Nodded. Together. "I do." Emma the months that followed, that must get lonely. Too fast and unbearably slow. Caught off guard by chemotherapy stole Sarah's he let out hair, a quiet laugh, thinned her frame, sometimes, but never dimmed the light in her eyes. There was a pause. Then she still hummed their favorite songs. "Did you have a wife?" Still smiled when Henry read the paper aloud. Her
name
laughter
was Sarah.
came softer now,
Emma
like
sat
wind
on the
through
step
distant
beside him,
trees.
legs crossed,
Neighbors
eyes
came by
wide.
with casseroles.
What was she like?
Offering kind words
Henry
and quiet
hesitated,
prayers.
but something in
Their
her
children
gaze,
visited
curious,
when they could,
kind,
bringing their own
unafraid,
little ones who
invited the
coloured
words
pictures
forward.
and sang songs for
He
Grandma
told her
Sarah.
about Sarah's garden,
Those
her
moments
piano
lit
lessons,
her face like
her way
sunlight
of
through
humming when she
stained
cooked.
glass. But as the
Emma
leaves
listened
outside
with
their
the
window turned
seriousness
from
of
green
someone
to
hearing a
gold,
story
Henry
that
could see
mattered.
the change.
Did she have a favourite song?
Sarah grew
Emma
tired more
asked.
quickly.
Henry smiled.
Her hands, once so
She
steady
did.
on the piano keys,
It was called
trembled
Autumn
now.
Leaves.
She spent more time
you
in
sing it?
bed,
She
her
asked.
voice softer
Henry
each
looked
day.
away.
One
It's been a
evening,
long time.
as the sky burned
Emma didn't
orange
push.
with the
She
setting
just
sun,
nodded and said,
Henry sat
"I'd like to
beside
hear it
her,
sometime,
holding her hand.
if you remember." The
"Play it
next
for
day
me,"
she
she
came
whispered,
again,
her
not to
eyes
rake
barely
leaves,
open.
but to sit on the
Our
porch
song,
and listen.
Henry's throat tightened.
And the day after
his
that,
fingers shook as he
bit
reached
by
for
bit,
the old guitar
Henry
that
found
leaned
himself
against the
talking
bedroom
more,
wall.
laughing more,
The same guitar
even
he
pulling
hadn't
out
touched
Sarah's
in
old
years.
photo albums to
Slowly,
show Emma pictures
clumsily,
of a life
he began
once
to play
fully
the
lived.
familiar melody of
One
Autumn
chilly
Leaves.
afternoon, Emma pointed
His
to
voice
the old
cracked
guitar,
on the first
leaning
words,
in the
but
corner
he
of the
kept
room.
going, each
Is
note
that yours?
carrying as much
Henry
love
nodded.
as his heart
Used
could
to be.
hold.
Can you play?
Sarah smiled
I
faintly,
could, he said,
her eyes
once,
closing
she
as the
smiled.
song wrapped softly
Would you
around
play
them
her
both.
song?
When the
Henry
song
looked at the
ended,
guitar for a long moment.
Henry set
his
the
fingers
guitar
twitched,
down and leaned
his throat
close,
tightened.
pressing
He
his
hadn't
lips to her
played since the
forehead.
night Sarah died.
"I love you," he whispered.
The strings had grown
She
dusty,
barely nodded,
the wood a
her
little
breath
dull,
shallow,
but the
her
memory of the
hand weak
music
in
still
his.
lived somewhere inside
That
him.
night, as the first
Gently,
frost of
he
the
picked it
season
up.
kissed the ground
His
outside,
fingers moved clumsily
Sarah
at
slipped
first,
quietly
fumbling
from this
across
world.
the frets.
Her hand
But the melody
still resting
slowly
in
began to
Henry's,
emerge,
the faint trace
soft,
of their song,
a little shaky,
lingering in the
but
air.
familiar.
The
As
house
he
grew
played,
unbearably
the room
still.
seemed to warm.
Henry stayed
Emma
there,
watched
beside her,
silently
for a long time,
her eyes
unwilling
wide,
to
her
let
hands
go of
folded
her hand,
in her lap,
as if holding on
when
tightly
the final
enough
note
could
faded,
somehow pull
Henry
her
looked
back.
up.
But some
Emma was
goodbyes
smiling.
are final.
That was
In the days
beautiful,
that followed,
she whispered.
the world moved
Did
on,
she sing it
as it
too?
always does.
Henry nodded.
All
There
the
were calls
time,
to make.
Emma
Arrangements
tilted
to
her head.
settle.
You should teach
flowers
it to me
to
so it doesn't
accept.
get forgotten.
People came and went,
Something in that
offering their
sentence stirred
condolences,
Henry's heart,
their kind
in a way he
words,
hadn't
their
expected.
well-meaning advice.
It wasn't just a
But
song.
the house,
It
their
was a
home,
thread, felt
a
hollow
lifeline
without her
from
laughter,
the past into the present,
without the sound of her soft
carried
humming,
forward by
filling
a new
the
voice.
spaces between the walls.
All right,
Everywhere
he
he
quietly,
turned,
there
let's
were
start with the
reminders of
first
the
line.
life they had built together. The roses blooming outside the kitchen window, the quilt she had sewn by hand still draped across the back of the couch, the half-filled jar of wildflower seeds she had meant to plant come spring. Henry moved through the days like a ghost in his own life, carrying the weight of her absence. Some nights he'd sit by the window, guitar in his lap, fingers resting on the strings but unable to play. The words of their song stayed trapped in his throat, too heavy to lift. Grief, he learned, is not a straight path. It is a winding road of memories and sorrow, of holding on and letting go. And though Sarah was gone, her love remained, stitched into the fabric of every moment they had shared. The house had never felt so big. Without Sarah, the walls seemed to echo. The once cheerful rooms held their breath, waiting for a voice that would never return. Henry moved through the spaces like a man adrift, each familiar object now a quiet witness to his grief. The children came, of course, when they heard the news. Emily, the eldest, flew in from Chicago with her husband and 2 young boys. Mark, their son, arrived from Seattle a day later, still wearing the weight of his busy life in the tightness of his shoulders. Anna, the youngest, came last, traveling from Boston, her eyes red-rimmed from crying even before she walked through the door. They hugged him, sat beside him, held his hand. They helped with the funeral arrangements, spoke softly when they talked, as if raising their voices might cause the fragile world around them to shatter. For a little while the house was filled again, with footsteps, with the voices of grandchildren laughing in the yard, with the aroma of Emily's cooking, trying to fill the space where Sarah's meals had always been. But life, as it does, moved forward. The children had jobs to return to, schools to attend, lives waiting miles and miles away. Promises were made. "I'll call you every week, Dad. We'll visit as soon as we can." And Henry knew they meant them. He knew their love was real, their intentions good. Still, when the door closed behind them and the last suitcase was loaded into the car, the silence returned like an old companion. Phone calls came, at first often, then less so. Life, with its busy hands, pulls at everyone in different directions. There were birthdays remembered, holidays shared through video calls, short visits when the calendar allowed. But more often than not, Henry sat alone at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the garden Sarah had once tended so carefully. He didn't blame them, not really. The world was different now. Fast-paced, full of deadlines and screens, miles of highways and packed schedules that made the distance between hearts feel even wider. Sometimes he wondered if they truly understood how empty the days could feel. There's a certain loneliness that comes not from the absence of people, but from the absence of those who truly see you, who know the shape of your heart, the weight of your memories, the stories behind the quiet glances. Sarah had been that person, and now, without her, the house was filled with the ghosts of conversations never spoken, words left unsaid. The holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving came and went. The kids called, their voices bright and apologetic through the phone. "I'm sorry we couldn't make it this year, Dad." Things got complicated. Henry understood. He always said he did. Christmas brought a box of gifts, shipped from afar, carefully wrapped, chosen with love but without the warmth of presents. Henry placed the unopened packages beneath the small artificial tree he set up in the corner of the living room, the same tree Sarah had insisted on buying years ago when they'd grown too tired to deal with pine needles on the carpet. He decorated it alone, hanging the ornaments they had collected over the decades. Each one carried a memory, the little porcelain angel from their first Christmas together, the wooden reindeer Sarah had found at a flea market, the silver bell from the year Emily was born. When the tree was done, he sat beside it, the glow of the lights casting soft shadows against the walls. The phone rang that evening. It was Anna. "Merry Christmas, Dad," she said, her voice gentle. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," he replied, forcing a smile she couldn't see. They talked for a few minutes, weather, work, the children's school plays, and then the call ended, the silence settling in once more. It wasn't anger that Henry felt. It wasn't even sadness, really. It was a quiet ache. The ache of distance. The ache of knowing that life had moved on for everyone else, while his own had slowed to the pace of remembering. The ache of wishing, just once, that someone would sit beside him and ask, "Tell me about Mum again." But no one did. So Henry kept the stories to himself, tucking them away like letters in a drawer, waiting for the right moment, the right heart, to share them with. It started with a knock on the door. Small, tentative, like the tap of a question. Henry opened it to find a young girl standing on the porch, no more than 10 years old, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, a shy look in her eyes. "Hi," she said. "My name's Emma. I live next door." Henry nodded slowly, surprised. He had seen her before, running across the lawn, drawing with chalk on the driveway, but they'd never spoken. "My mum said you might need help with the leaves," Emma added, pointing at the yard where golden piles had begun to gather beneath the trees. Henry looked past her, then back at the girl. "You want to help rake?" Emma shrugged. "I like being outside, and Mum says it's good to help neighbors." Something about her honesty made him smile. "All right then," he said. "Let's get you a rake." That afternoon, they worked side by side. Emma talked more as the leaves piled up, about school, her little brother who ate everything, and how she wanted to be a writer when she grew up, or maybe an astronaut. Henry mostly listened, chiming in now and then, letting her words fill the quiet that had become too familiar. When they finished, she followed him up to the porch. "Do you live here all by yourself?" she asked. Henry nodded. "I do." Emma looked thoughtful. That must get lonely. Henry blinked, caught off guard by her candor. He let out a quiet laugh. Sometimes, he admitted. There was a pause, then she asked, "Did you have a wife?" "Yes," Henry said softly. Her name was Sarah. Emma sat on the step beside him, legs crossed, eyes wide. What was she like? Henry hesitated, but something in her gaze, curious, kind, unafraid, invited the words forward. He told her about Sarah's garden, her piano lessons, her way of humming when she cooked. Emma listened with the seriousness of someone hearing a story that mattered. "Did she have a favorite song?" Emma asked. Henry smiled. She did. It was called Autumn Leaves. "Can you sing it?" she asked. Henry looked away. "It's been a long time." Emma didn't push. She just nodded and said, "I'd like to hear it sometime, if you remember." The next day she came again, not to rake leaves, but to sit on the porch and listen. And the day after that. Bit by bit, Henry found himself talking more, laughing more, even pulling out Sarah's old photo albums to show Emma pictures of a life once fully lived. One chilly afternoon, Emma pointed to the old guitar leaning in the corner of the room. "Is that yours?" Henry nodded. "Used to be." "Can you play?" "I could," he said. "Once." She smiled. "Would you play her song?" Henry looked at the guitar for a long moment. His fingers twitched, his throat tightened. He hadn't played since the night Sarah died. The strings had grown dusty, the wood a little dull, but the memory of the music still lived somewhere inside him. Gently, he picked it up. His fingers moved clumsily at first, fumbling across the frets. But the melody slowly began to emerge, soft, a little shaky, but familiar. As he played, the room seemed to warm. Emma watched silently, her eyes wide, her hands folded in her lap. When the final note faded, Henry looked up. Emma was smiling. "That was beautiful," she whispered. "Did she sing it too?" Henry nodded. "All the time." Emma tilted her head. "You should teach it to me so it doesn't get forgotten." Something in that sentence stirred Henry's heart in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just a song. It was a thread, a lifeline from the past into the present, carried forward by a new voice. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's start with the first line." The days grew shorter, the wind a little colder, but something inside Henry had begun to thaw. Every afternoon, Emma came over, sometimes bringing cookies, sometimes just her presence. They sat on the porch as the sun dipped low and the sky blushed pink and gold. She asked questions about Sarah, about Henry's childhood, about what the world used to be like before everything had screens. And Henry answered. He told stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. He dusted off memories like old records, placing them carefully on the turntable of their conversation. Emma listened as if each word mattered. And to her it did. They practiced the song together, line by line. Emma's voice, soft and unsure at first, grew stronger with each passing week. Henry's fingers, though slower now, found their way back to familiar chords. The melody of Autumn Leaves once again filled the little white house. One late October afternoon, Henry stood at the edge of the porch, watching the last leaves fall from the tall oak tree. He could feel winter waiting just beyond the horizon. In the air, in his bones, in the slowing beat of his heart. He wasn't afraid. That evening, Emma brought her parents. She wore a simple dress and held the guitar carefully in her small hands. With Henry seated beside her, she sang Autumn Leaves, her voice trembling only slightly, the notes rising like soft breath into the cool evening sky. Neighbors came too, drawn by the music, by the warmth of a shared moment. They sat on folding chairs and front steps, hands cupped around warm drinks, hearts open. When the last note faded, there was silence. Then applause. But Henry didn't hear the clapping, not really. He was watching Emma, her eyes bright with pride. and for the first time in a long time, he felt something that wasn't grief. It was something quieter, gentler, a kind of peace. Later that night, Henry sat alone on the porch, wrapped in Sarah's old quilt. The moon hung low, casting a soft glow over the lawn. The oak tree stood tall, bare now, its branches like open arms. He closed his eyes and listened, not to sound, but to memory, to laughter, to music, to the voice of a woman singing in the kitchen, to the footsteps of children running through the house, to the soft giggle of a girl who had asked to learn a song so it wouldn't be forgotten. So much of life, he realized, is letting go. But just as much of it is giving. And Henry had given. Love, stories, song. As the wind moved gently through the empty branches above, Henry smiled. His story wasn't lost. It had simply changed hands. It's never too late to share your song with the world.